Westeros has seen its fair share of terrible leaders, but some kings were so catastrophically bad, they make Joffrey Baratheon look like a reasonable ruler. These aren't just incompetent monarchs, they're psychopaths, religious fanatics, and idiots who nearly destroyed the Seven Kingdoms through their spectacular failures. Today, I'm breaking down the 8 absolute worst kings to ever sit on the Iron Throne. And trust me, their reigns were so disastrous they make modern politics look functional by comparison. And when you learn about King number 3, you'll understand why some dynasties deserve to be overthrown. Let's get into it. Before we dive into these royal disasters, we need to understand something about Westeros. It's a realm where one bad king can undo decades of prosperity and stability. Without checks and balances, a single ruler's madness, incompetence, or cruelty can lead to war, famine, and the deaths of thousands. In Game of Thrones, we witness the aftermath of Robert Baratheon's mediocre rule and the brief, brutal reign of Joffrey. But the history of the Seven Kingdoms is filled with far worse kings whose terrible decisions shaped the Westeros we see in the show. I've analyzed the complete history of the Seven Kingdoms to identify the 8 worst kings to ever wear the crown. These aren't just bad rulers, they're cautionary tales about what happens when the wrong person gains absolute power. So let's count down the 8 worst kings in the history of Westeros, ranked by their incompetence, cruelty, and the lasting damage they did to the realm. Maegor I Targaryen, the Cruel. When your official nickname is the Cruel, you know you failed as a king. Maegor Targaryen, the 3rd Targaryen king to sit on the Iron Throne, earned this title through years of brutality that nearly destroyed his dynasty just as it was beginning. Maegor was the son of Aegon the Conqueror, but he lacked his father's strategic mind and charisma. What he did inherit was the Targaryen capacity for violence, which he took to unprecedented extremes. After his half-brother Aenys died, Maegor seized the throne from his nephew Aegon, beginning his reign with an act of treachery. His 6-year rule was defined by bloodshed on a scale that shocked even the hardened lords of Westeros. When the Faith militant rose against him, Maegor didn't just defeat them, he enacted a campaign of extermination. He burned sepits with worshippers inside, had warriors of the Faith flayed alive, and once invited 2,000 members of the Faith to a feast offering amnesty, only to massacre them all in what became known as the Burning of the Sept of Remembrance. Maegor's personal life was equally disturbing. He had 6 wives, most of whom died horribly. His 3rd wife, Tiana of the Tower, confessed to poisoning the wombs of his other wives before Maegor tortured her to death. He was so desperate for an heir that he cut open the bellies of his pregnant wives to see if they carried sons. None survived. His crowning architectural achievement was completing the Red Keep, but even this was tainted by his cruelty. After the construction was finished, he executed all the builders to ensure its secrets, including hidden passages, died with them. What makes Maegor truly one of the worst kings is that he nearly destroyed the Targaryen dynasty just as it was establishing itself. By the end of his reign, he had alienated nearly every lord in the Seven Kingdoms. He died on the Iron Throne, either by suicide or murder, and was succeeded by the very nephew he had usurped. Maegor's legacy was so terrible that for centuries afterward, Westerosi would say of cruel kings, "He's another Maegor." His reign became the standard against which all royal atrocities were measured. Aegon IV Targaryen, the Unworthy. If Maegor was defined by cruelty, Aegon IV was defined by incompetence, corruption, and an insatiable appetite for pleasure that eventually tore the realm apart. Known as the Unworthy, Aegon IV's 12-year reign was a masterclass in how personal vices can become political catastrophes. Aegon IV was gluttonous in every sense of the word. He began his reign as a handsome, charismatic king, but ended it so obese he could barely move, covered in boils and unable to climb stairs. His appetites extended beyond food to women. He had hundreds of mistresses during his reign, from noblewomen to prostitutes, and fathered at least 9 bastards that we know of. His court was a cesspool of corruption, where positions and favors were granted based on which lords provided him with the most beautiful mistresses. He gave away priceless Targaryen heirlooms to his favorites, including the Valyrian steel sword Blackfire, which he gave to his bastard son Daemon rather than his legitimate heir. But Aegon IV's most catastrophic decision came on his deathbed. With his final breath, he legitimized all of his bastards, giving them the Targaryen name and a claim to the throne. This single act led to 5 Blackfire rebellions over the next century, as his bastard line repeatedly tried to claim the Iron Throne from his legitimate descendants. The first Blackfire rebellion alone killed thousands, including many of the realm's greatest knights and lords. The subsequent rebellions further weakened the Targaryen dynasty, draining resources and creating divisions that would never fully heal. What makes Aegon IV truly one of the worst kings is that his failures weren't due to madness or ideology. They were due to pure selfishness. He cared only for his own pleasures, with no thought for the consequences. His reign was so disastrous that it took the exceptional rule of his son Daeron II to prevent the immediate collapse of the dynasty. The legacy of the Unworthy lasted for generations, with the final Blackfyre pretender dying only about 40 years before the events of Game of Thrones. His selfish indulgence created a century of bloodshed that weakened House Targaryen and set the stage for their eventual downfall. Aerys II Targaryen, the Mad King. Aerys II, better known as the Mad King, is the most recent example of a truly terrible ruler, and his actions directly set up the world we see in Game of Thrones. What makes Aerys particularly tragic is that he didn't start out as a monster. He descended into madness over the course of his 20-year reign. Early in his rule, Aerys showed promise. He was charming, ambitious, and surrounded himself with capable advisors, including his friend Tywin Lannister, who served as his hand. But after being held captive during the defiance of Duskendale, Aerys' paranoia spiraled out of control. He became obsessed with fire, particularly wildfire, finding sexual excitement in watching people burn alive. He executed hundreds, including Rickard Stark, who was roasted in his own armor while his son Brandon strangled himself trying to save him. Aerys' preferred method of execution, burning people alive, revealed his sadistic nature and his delusion that he might transform into a dragon. His paranoia extended to everyone around him, including his own son Rhaegar and his once trusted hand Tywin Lannister. He refused to cut his hair or nails, fearing assassins with blades, and eventually resembled a walking corpse with long matted hair and inch-long yellow fingernails. Aerys' treatment of his wife, Queen Rhaella, was particularly disturbing. He would visit her chambers after executing someone by fire and rape her so violently that her screams could be heard throughout the Red Keep. Even his Kingsguard, sworn to protect the royal family, were forbidden from intervening. The final straw came when Aerys demanded the heads of Ned Stark and Robert Baratheon after Rhaegar allegedly kidnapped Lyanna Stark. This triggered Robert's rebellion, which ended with the near extinction of House Targaryen and the end of their 300-year dynasty. What makes Aerys truly one of the worst kings is that his madness destroyed not just his own rule, but his entire family's claim to the throne. His actions were so horrific that they legitimized the rebellion against him and turned House Targaryen from the royal dynasty into exiles and targets. In his final moments, Aerys ordered his pyromancers to ignite caches of wildfire throughout King's Landing, intending to burn the city and its 500,000 inhabitants rather than surrender, the ultimate expression of his madness and cruelty. Only Jaime Lannister's decision to kill him prevented this genocide, earning Jaime the title Kingslayer but saving countless lives. Baelor, the first Targaryen, the Blessed. Not all terrible kings are cruel or corrupt. Some are terrible because their virtues become extremes. Baelor the first Targaryen, known as Baelor the Blessed, was a king whose religious fanaticism nearly destroyed the realm through well-intentioned madness. Baelor was the 9th Targaryen king, and unlike most of his family, he was deeply devoted to the faith of the Seven. This devotion crossed into zealotry that affected every aspect of his rule. Upon taking the throne, he immediately freed the realm from a hostage situation by walking barefoot to Dorne to make peace, an admirable act that nearly killed him due to snake bites and desert heat. But his religious extremism quickly became dangerous. He imprisoned his 3 sisters in a part of the Red Keep that became known as the Maiden Vault, not to protect them, but to protect himself and other men from their beauty, which he considered sinful temptation. These weren't criminals. They were princesses confined for years simply for being attractive. Baelor appointed a common stonemason as High Septon because he claimed the smith spoke through the man. When this High Septon died, Baelor appointed an 8-year-old boy who couldn't read as the next High Septon because he believed the child could work miracles. His most destructive act was burning books containing knowledge that contradicted religious teachings, including ancient Valyrian scrolls with irreplaceable information about dragons and magic. This destruction of knowledge was a catastrophic loss for the realm. Baelor's personal habits were equally extreme. He fasted so frequently and severely that he often collapsed. He would walk the city barefoot, tending to the poor and sick, which was admirable but neglected his actual duties as king. His hand, his uncle Viserys, effectively ran the kingdom while Baelor focused on religious matters. Ultimately, Baelor starved himself to death after a 40-day fast, leaving no heirs because he had never consummated his marriage, believing sexual relations to be sinful. Some historians suggest he was actually poisoned by his hand to prevent further damage to the realm. What makes Baelor truly one of the worst kings is that his religious extremism undermined the very institutions needed for stable governance. By elevating unqualified religious figures, destroying knowledge, and neglecting his duties, he weakened the crown and the realm. His blessed reputation among the small folk masked the long-term damage his reign caused to Westeros. Joffrey Baratheon, the Illborn. Joffrey Baratheon is the king most familiar to viewers of Game of Thrones, and his brief, brutal reign demonstrates how a single terrible ruler can plunge an entire continent into war. What makes Joffrey particularly dangerous isn't just his cruelty, but the combination of sadism, cowardice, and stupidity that defined his character. Technically, Joffrey wasn't even a legitimate king. He was the product of incest between Cersei and Jaime Lannister, with no Baratheon blood at all. This secret was the catalyst for the War of the Five Kings, as both Stannis and Renly Baratheon claimed the throne after learning of Joffrey's true parentage. Joffrey's reign began with an act of impulsive cruelty that doomed the realm to years of war. Despite promises of mercy, he ordered the execution of Ned Stark, destroying any hope of peace between House Stark and House Lannister. This single decision triggered the North's secession and rebellion, costing thousands of lives. His sadism was evident in countless acts, forcing one prostitute to beat another for his amusement, using a crossbow on Rose, tormenting Sansa Stark, and threatening to serve her brother's head at their wedding feast. He took particular pleasure in humiliating those who couldn't fight back, revealing his fundamental cowardice. This cowardice was on full display during the Battle of the Blackwater, where he fled the walls when the fighting grew dangerous, abandoning his men and destroying their morale. Only Tyrion's leadership and Tywin's timely arrival saved the city from Stannis. Despite his cruelty, Joffrey was also remarkably stupid and easily manipulated. He had no understanding of governance, military strategy, or diplomacy. He made enemies needlessly and alienated potential allies through insults and threats. Even his grandfather Tywin couldn't control his worst impulses. What makes Joffrey truly one of the worst kings is that his brief reign caused disproportionate damage to the realm. In less than 2 years on the throne, he managed to trigger a civil war, alienate half the kingdom, deplete the royal treasury, and undermine the legitimacy of the monarchy itself. His death by poison at his own wedding was so satisfying to viewers precisely because it represented a rare moment of justice in a world where the cruel often prosper. Even in death, however, Joffrey's legacy of chaos continued, as his younger brother Tommen inherited a fractured kingdom that would never fully heal. Aenys I Targaryen, the Weak. Not all terrible kings are monsters. Some are simply catastrophically weak. Aenys I Targaryen, the second Targaryen king and son of Aegon the Conqueror, demonstrates how indecision and weakness can be just as destructive as active cruelty. Aenys inherited a newly forged kingdom that was still adjusting to Targaryen rule. Unlike his father, who was a decisive conqueror, Aenys was scholarly, gentle, and conflict-averse. Qualities that might make a good man but made for a disastrous king in the brutal world of Westeros. His reign faced multiple rebellions, including those led by the Vulture King in the Dornish Marches, Harren the Red in the Riverlands, and Janos Arryn in the Vale. In each case, Aenys hesitated, wavered, and failed to respond decisively. It was his half-brother Maegor and his lords who actually put down these rebellions, while Aenys fretted. The fatal blow to his rule came when he allowed his son Aegon to marry his daughter Rhaena, following Targaryen tradition but outraging the Faith of the Seven, which considered incest an abomination. The faith militant rose in open rebellion, and Aenys, rather than confronting the crisis, fled to Dragonstone. The stress of the rebellion literally killed him. He collapsed under the pressure and died after a short illness, possibly poisoned by his own wife at the suggestion of Maegor. He was only 35 years old and had ruled for just 5 years. What makes Aenys truly one of the worst kings is that his weakness created the power vacuum that allowed his half-brother Maegor to seize the throne and institute a reign of terror. Had Aenys been stronger, more decisive, and better able to balance Targaryen traditions with the sensibilities of his subjects, the faith militant uprising might have been avoided or at least contained. Aenys represents a different kind of failure than the cruel or corrupt kings on this list. He was a decent man, utterly unsuited to the crown he wore. His legacy was so negative that for generations afterward, Targaryens avoided naming their sons Aenys due to the association with weakness and failure. Aerys I Targaryen, the Bookish. Aerys I Targaryen demonstrates how a king's neglect can be just as damaging as active misrule. The 12th Targaryen king, Aerys I, was neither cruel nor weak. He simply didn't care about governing at all, preferring to lose himself in books and mystical studies while the realm suffered. Aerys inherited the throne after the Blackfyre Rebellion had nearly torn the Seven Kingdoms apart. Rather than focusing on healing these divisions, he retreated into his library, delegating all governance to his hand, Brynden Rivers, also known as Bloodraven. He had no interest in warfare, politics, or even continuing his line. He never consummated his marriage to Eleanor Penrose, leaving no heirs. During his reign, Westeros faced multiple crises that required strong leadership. The Great Spring Sickness, a devastating plague, killed tens of thousands, including members of the royal family. The Ironborn under Dagon Greyjoy raided the western shores with impunity. A second Blackfire rebellion erupted. Through all these crises, Aerys remained buried in his books, leaving Bloodraven to handle everything. While Bloodraven was competent in many ways, his methods were brutal and controversial. He created a network of spies and informants, executed hundreds of suspected Blackfire supporters, and ruled through fear rather than respect. His infamous saying, "How many eyes does Lord Bloodraven have? 1,000 eyes and one," reflected the paranoia of his rule. What makes Aerys I truly one of the worst kings is that he abandoned the fundamental responsibility of kingship, to rule. By abdicating his duties to Bloodraven, he allowed methods of governance that further divided the realm and deepened the wounds from the Blackfire Rebellion rather than healing them. His scholarly neglect also had long-term consequences for House Targaryen. By failing to produce an heir, he complicated the succession, eventually leading to the crown passing to his younger brother Maegor. This pattern of problematic successions would continue to plague the Targaryens, contributing to their eventual downfall. Aerys I represents a different kind of failure than the more actively terrible kings on this list. He wasn't cruel or mad, just completely disengaged. His reign shows that a king who does nothing can be just as damaging as one who does terrible things. Robert I Baratheon, the Usurper. Robert Baratheon might seem like an odd choice for this list. After all, his reign was relatively peaceful compared to the chaos that preceded and followed it. But Robert's inclusion demonstrates how even a seemingly good king can be terrible through neglect, indulgence, and failure to prepare for the future. Robert was a brilliant warrior who won his crown on the battlefield, smashing Rhaegar Targaryen's chest with his warhammer at the Trident. But the skills that make a good rebel rarely make a good ruler. Once the fighting stopped, Robert had no interest in the actual business of governance. Instead, he spent his days hunting, drinking, and whoring, fathering at least 16 bastards, while his marriage to Cersei Lannister grew increasingly bitter. He delegated all actual governance to his hand, Jon Arryn, and his small council, showing up to meetings only when forced and usually drunk. Under his rule, the crown went from wealthy to deeply in debt, owing millions to the Iron Bank of Braavos and House Lannister. This financial catastrophe was partly due to Robert's excessive spending on tournaments and feasts, including a tourney for Prince Joffrey's name day that cost 100,000 gold dragons. Perhaps Robert's greatest failure was his complete lack of attention to the succession. He had no legitimate children, though he believed he did, made no effort to train Joffrey to be a better king, and ignored the growing power of House Lannister at court. When he died, killed by a boar while drunk on hunting, he left a power vacuum that plunged the realm into the War of the Five Kings. What makes Robert truly one of the worst kings is that he squandered the opportunity to establish a new, stable dynasty after the Targaryens. He had widespread support, a strong claim through his Targaryen grandmother, and capable advisors. Instead, his indulgence, neglect, and failure to secure the succession undid all the potential good of his rebellion. Robert's reign shows that a king doesn't need to be cruel or mad to be terrible. Simple neglect and self-indulgence can be just as destructive in the long run. His failure set the stage for the chaos and bloodshed that defined Game of Thrones, making him indirectly responsible for much of the suffering that followed his death. These 8 kings represent the worst that the Iron Throne has seen, men whose cruelty, weakness, neglect, or incompetence caused immense suffering and changed the course of Westerosi history. From Maegor's brutality to Robert's neglect, each failed in their fundamental duty, to protect and govern the realm. What's particularly striking is how diverse their failures were. Some were actively malevolent, like Maegor and Joffrey. Others were well-intentioned but disastrous, like Baelor. Some were simply uninterested in ruling, like Aerys I and Robert. This diversity of failure demonstrates a crucial truth about power in Westeros. There are countless ways to be a terrible king, but very few ways to be a good one. These kings also reveal something important about the Targaryen dynasty and the institution of monarchy itself. The Targaryens' practice of inbreeding, meant to keep their bloodline pure, instead produced a genetic lottery where brilliance and madness were often separated by a coin flip. Kings like Aerys II and Baelor show how this genetic instability could produce rulers who were fundamentally unfit to govern. More broadly, these terrible kings highlight the fundamental flaw in absolute monarchy. When power depends entirely on the character of one person, the realm is always one bad ruler away from catastrophe. No matter how strong the institutions or how capable the advisors, a truly terrible king can undo generations of progress and stability. By the time of Game of Thrones, the Iron Throne itself had become a symbol of this dysfunctional system. As Daenerys says in the final episode, the wheel of competing great houses had been crushing the common people for centuries, with these terrible kings representing the worst of that oppression. Perhaps that's why the series ends with a partial break from absolute hereditary monarchy, as Bran is chosen by the lords rather than inheriting the throne. Whether this new system will produce better rulers remains to be seen, but the legacy of these 8 terrible kings suggests that almost any change would be an improvement. If you enjoyed this breakdown of Westeros' worst kings, hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments which of these royal disasters you think did the most damage to the realm. This is Explainified, and I'll see you in the next video. Thanks for watching this deep dive into the worst kings of Westeros. If you want to learn more about the history that shaped Game of Thrones, check out my video on the greatest warriors in Westerosi history, which I'll link right here. And don't forget to subscribe for more Game of Thrones explained videos coming every week. This is Explainified, and I'll see you in the next one.